microphones too.
Absolutely, yeah. I can do that. Right. What I'm going to talk about today very much follows on from Fred's work and also is informed by a number of the IDRC studies that have been done in the past. So hopefully the two will stream together and can inform our discussion afterwards. What I'm going to talk about is a review that was done by a small team for the UK Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, who had very much a policy interest in the impact of the quite large R&D programme that they fund and started to ask questions about whether that research was really impacting on their policy making. And this is a study that was done by myself, Ben Shaw from the Policy Studies Institute, and Siobhan Fitzpatrick, who's here somewhere, who's there. Did a lot of the hard work that I'm going to describe. Which one of these is?
Forward arrow.
Yeah. I'm just very briefly going to say the sort of methods we used in this review. We were trying to apply sort of systematic techniques in this literature to try and get as much literature together as we could. And so we searched 10 research databases, but also spent quite a lot of time searching the grey literature, so trying to get hold of the reports of policy organisations who'd been doing their own work in this field and basically found a tremendous amount of work that hadn't previously been identified in our work, really, that was done by small organisations thinking about the impact of their own work, developing frameworks and applying methods. So that was a very rich source for us, was that kind of more informal literature. We had a range of questions from the funders, which were about how people, so the tools and techniques people use to evaluate the impact of research, how do people go about doing it, what are the pros and cons of different approaches, and inevitably some questions about the kind of effectiveness of these methods and the value for money of the different approaches people use. And we were, as John was saying at the start, kind of steered towards looking at the environmental literature, but they were also concerned to learn from what had been done in other fields, and particularly there was an interest in international development, and that was sort of captured in the review. I just wanted to flag up how our review fits with the kind of literature more generally on impact assessment, in that we were essentially just looking at what research programs, single studies, reviews, the impact that they had had on policy. And we weren't looking at the range of other users that might be of interest, for example, the effects on practitioners, on local groups. We were really focusing, because DEFRA had a kind of policy remit, on the impact on policymakers. And we also weren't looking so much at the effect of interventions, so things that you might do, actions you might take, networks you might take, set up, the impact of those kind of activities, specifically on impact on policy. We were looking very much at how the research had had an impact on this kind of group of policymakers. This is sort of taken from Sandra Nutley's model for understanding some of the kind of dimensions that are out there in the world of kind of policy use. Ooh, blimey, that was good. Just to give you an idea of where the literature came from, quite a lot of literature from the UK, from the US, from Canada, and also some kind of wider coverage in terms of Belgium, Denmark, Germany, kind of smaller numbers of studies. And what we're currently involved in at the moment is a study to try harder to find research from other countries, so to sort of really be more proactive about picking up studies from elsewhere. And we've identified another 40 studies coming from different countries and contexts. And in terms of the fields the studies came from, so in terms of today, 26 from international development, 26 from the environment, and then these which were quite hard to categorise, which were more general papers about from the evaluation literature that weren't really tied to a specific field. So quite a diverse area really that the literature came from, and given that, some very consistent findings. A final thing to say about the sample is that what we were really looking for was evaluations of impact on research and policy. That's what we were very interested in, people who'd done the job of evaluating how impactful a policy research program had been. And we found a relatively small amount of those, considering that was the prime aim of our search, but much more kind of reflective pieces with people talking about how important it was to evaluate the impact on policy, what methods you might take, reviews drawing together different approaches. And a couple of sort of studies that were and reflective pieces about kind of a value for money and effectiveness. Did I do that? I thought the microphone was going so well. It's not moving enough. Really? I thinks I'm dead. What I'm going to go on to talk about is quite hard without the thing. So what we did was we mapped all the different approaches that people took within their studies. So basically the methodologies that people are employed to look at impact. And what we found is that people almost exclusively in this field are using mixed method approaches. So they're using case studies, interviews, surveys, bibliometrics. They're combining methods in their studies, and that's considered generally to be good practice. What was interesting among this was there are some methods people talk about more than they use. And bibliometrics are the most common example of that, where people talk a lot about how important it is to track impact on not just academic publications, but on policy documents. But it's actually a relatively it's a developing field, and not a lot of people are putting this into practice. And then there's another group where people don't talk much about the methods, but actually use them quite a lot in their work. And an interesting example of this is using telephone interviews, where people don't talk about it much, the methodology. But actually, if you're trying to do impact studies, it can be a very cost-effective way of reaching out to quite a lot of people. So there's quite a lot of use of that method and not much discussion of it. And then the other set of papers, things we looked at within the papers, was the kind of frameworks that people were using to think about impact evaluation. And we sort of identified quite a broad range of frameworks, but not an enormous amount of use of these frameworks in people's work. So that there was some kind of citation maybe of the frameworks, but not using them to give an overall view. Thank you. These are all the different methods. And so these are the frameworks people were using. And the most common framework that we picked up on is something called the HERG payback method, which is the Health Economics Research Group at Brunel University developed a payback method, as they describe it, which is a copy of a summary of the report outside, which has got a bit of detail about their work. And it basically identifies 5 different what they call impact dimensions, which include the wider society, policy, practice, the economy, and within those different dimensions they carry out evaluative activities. So that's the most sort of widely talked about and used model. There are quite a lot of economic analysis models talked about in the literature on impact assessment, but they're often used as part of a study that also employs other frameworks and ideas. And the rapid outcome assessment model is another one that's both talked about and used in people's evaluations, and has started to be picked up a bit by people working outside of the organisation, which, again, with the HERG framework, is a framework that people have tried to apply elsewhere. But really, in terms of, there's lots of frameworks here, but very low levels of use. And one of the things we identified in our review was this is a field where there's quite a need to have a conceptual framework for your evaluative activities and for your understanding of what it means to do impact assessment. And as Fred was talking about, there are lots of different ways you can think about that can inform your work, but it's not really common practice, and people often go out to do assessment with a sort of a toolbox, if you like, of research methods rather than a framework for understanding what's going on in the relationship between research policy and practice. I just wanted to pull out a couple of examples. One is where they've used the HERG payback model, and this is in the UK Economic and Social Research Future of Work programme, where they had a go at applying what's essentially a model that was developed in health research to workforce research. And this is quite an interesting model, where they did key informant interviews, document reviews, online surveys, and also did a number of case studies to give a more rich and informed account of impact, of policy impact. And what's interesting about that study is I think it's fairly typical in its mixed method approach, but less typical in the fact that it's adopted a model and tried really hard to work within it. The other one is the Netherlands Environment Institute. This is very much a policy-driven attempt at evaluation, where they sort of, as a policy team, sat down and said, what we need to do is understand better our impact, and put some quite tight requirements on their policymakers to be clear about how they were using research. And they did a compulsory survey, which I think is the only example we found of compulsory evaluation in the field, which was sent out to people, and they were asked to demonstrate the research they'd used in policy development. And I think that's an interesting example of where it was a very policy-led attempt to understand research impact. So how do people generally carry out evaluations? A mixed methods approach, fairly conventional ideas, and one of the things that came out of the review for us was the need to be thinking innovatively, particularly with the new technologies that are available to us, about how we might carry out impact evaluation, And certainly there's not a tremendous amount of use of kind of online surveying and kind of email contact with people and those kind of things, and that there might be kind of new ways and new cost-effective ways that we could get a feel for how research is being used. The funders were very interested in what the pros and cons of different approaches are, and in our long report, there's a copy of outside, we've kind of painstakingly gone through all the studies and identified the kind of pros and cons identified by the authors. But basically, as in all research practice, the key thing was that, it depends what you're using the methods for, and the kind of main driver was that you're looking to use a mixed method approach if you want to kind of be able to really reflect on impact. And inevitably, DEFRA were very concerned also to see which methods were both effective and cost-effective, and we didn't find a lot of literature. It was hard enough to find people doing and writing about their impact evaluations. I don't think this necessarily means people aren't doing them, but maybe it's something that doesn't get written up so often. And that where they were written up, there was probably maybe a paragraph of text where people reflected on how effective the methods they'd used were. And the only kind of real studies that have been done are around the Herg payback model, which has just generally been used more, and so the people doing it have had an opportunity to be more reflective. And as part of that, they suggest that kind of questionnaires have quite a value in this field, but only if they're kind of complemented with case studies to really get some meaningful understanding of what's going on. The kind of main message in terms of cost effectiveness and value for money was about people saying that essentially this is never going to be a field where you get to evaluate everything and you get to look at a program as a whole and every single aspect of it in detail. So there were some real questions for evaluators about where you focused your attention and what cases that you decided to focus on. And I think those very pragmatic issues were coming through from the literature. And again, this idea that maybe telephone surveys are one of the kind of potentially cost-effective options people might choose. Just to finish, we identified from the literature, as very much work in progress, going to appear in some horrible way, 8 dimensions of sort of questions you might ask, if you like, when you're thinking about doing a research impact evaluation. And these are still in development, and any feedback you've got will be very helpful. But essentially, we're suggesting that one of the useful questions you can ask is whether you have a conceptual framework to inform your work, what the outcomes of interest to you are and whether you're clear about those, what methods you think would be best to explore those outcomes, how you're addressing the issue of attribution, which is particularly difficult in this field where often the impacts and outcomes come way down the line, and you're kind of trying to track and understand how those occurred. What's the best direction of travel for evaluation? So are you taking a piece of research and going out into the world to see what happens to that research and see whether you can find people who've used it, or whether you're starting with a kind of a policy and working back from that policy to see whether you can find pieces of research referenced in it and referenced in the kind of policy formulation process. Those are two very different ways of looking at the issue. I mean, the argument is if you start with the research, you're more likely to pick up some impact, so maybe that's the best way to go about it. Very pragmatic literature. Taking a mixed method approach is important and gives you scope for triangulation. Will the methods capture the complexity of change? And I think, as Fred was talking about, it's one of the values of case studies, that they offer you an opportunity to really understand what's going on. And when might be the best time to conduct evaluation? I'll be really interested to hear if you've got any reflections on whether 18 years, where it is on that sort of spectrum, that is the kind of ideal time to start looking for impact. Just to say, there is a summary outside of the report, and there's also a paper coming out in Science and Policy next month, which summarises the research and also develops this framework a little bit further. We're also updating the review and currently trying to incorporate these 40 other papers from other countries, trying also to find some literature in other languages, because people have written about this elsewhere. And also to mention our journal, Evidence and Policy, which there are some flyers outside if anyone's interested in the journal, which sort of publishes quite a lot of work in this area, and very interested if you're writing in this area for contributions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very